Can you imagine? A respected professor, once honored with national awards, caught dumping black plastic bags into a freezing river, and inside those bags were the dismembered remains of his young lover. If this story chills you to the bone, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support helps us keep these haunting cases alive. A promising student with a dark secret. Anastasia Yeshchenko was 24 years old, and by all accounts, her future looked bright. Friends and professors at St. Petersburg State University often described her as intelligent, ambitious, and deeply dedicated to her studies. She was majoring in history, a field she loved with passion, and she dreamed of becoming a respected academic, perhaps even a professor one day. Her classmates recalled how her eyes lit up when she spoke about literature or Napoleon's battles, and how her energy seemed endless when it came to research. She was the kind of student who not only pursued knowledge, but lived inside it. On the surface, Anastasia's life seemed enviable. She had the sharp intellect of a rising scholar, the warmth of a daughter who spoke to her family often, and the admiration of friends who believed she would achieve great things. Yet behind that promising exterior, behind the cheerful smiles that appeared in photographs, there was a hidden truth, one that very few knew the full depth of. Anastasia was involved in a secret relationship, and that relationship would soon prove to be her undoing. The man in her life was not another student. He was not even close to her age. Instead, it was one of her professors, Oleg Sokolov. A man 40 years older. He was one of Russia's most recognized historians. To those who admired him, Sokolov was a brilliant academic, a decorated expert on Napoleon Bonaparte. He was frequently seen giving lectures in packed halls, writing articles that earned him awards, and even participating in historical reenactments where he dressed as French generals, complete with medals and sabers. In the academic world, his name carried weight. In some circles, he was seen almost as a celebrity. But brilliance, as history often reminds us, can be a mask. Behind the curtain of intellectual success was a deeply troubled man. Those who knew him well spoke, sometimes only in whispers, about his volatile temper. He could be charming, eloquent, even captivating, yet his personality shifted quickly when challenged. Colleagues recalled moments when he erupted in fury over minor disagreements. Former students had sensed something unnerving beneath the surface, though few dared to confront him. Like many powerful men in academic institutions, his prestige shielded him from scrutiny. For Anastasia, the relationship began innocently. To her, he was a mentor, a professor who seemed fascinated by her intellect, who praised her essays, who promised to guide her career. In her early 20s, the attention from such a prominent figure must have felt exhilarating. He made her feel chosen, exceptional, and important. But as the relationship deepened, its darker undertones emerged. Friends began to notice changes in her. She no longer appeared as carefree as before. She was quieter, sometimes hesitant, sometimes visibly stressed. When asked, she brushed off their concerns. She hinted that her relationship with Sokolov was complicated, but she rarely shared the full story. What she didn't reveal, at least not openly, was that he had grown possessive, jealous of her independence, quick to anger, and determined to control her life. In private, Sokolov's behavior became increasingly suffocating. He would monitor her movements, question her choices, and lash out in moments of insecurity. To outsiders, he was still the brilliant professor in Napoleon's costume, posing for cameras with a soldier's posture. But to Anastasia, he was a man whose shadow grew darker each day. She confided to a close friend that she was considering ending the relationship, that she felt trapped by his obsessive hold. That confession, spoken quietly, would later echo like a warning no one could stop. The imbalance of power between them was undeniable. She was a student, still shaping her identity and her career. He was a man in his 60s, established, well-connected, revered by many. For Anastasia, disentangling herself from him was not as simple as walking away. Their lives had become intertwined, academically, personally, emotionally. And Sokolov, for all his scholarly brilliance, was not a man who accepted rejection lightly. By the autumn of 2019, tension was rising. Friends recalled her growing distance. Her parents noticed her less frequent calls. Beneath her academic focus lay the silent weight of a relationship that had turned toxic. Those who saw them together often felt the mismatch, the young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and the aging professor clinging desperately to the illusion of control. Anastasia's life was, in many ways, a symbol of promise. She embodied the energy of youth, the hunger for knowledge, and the hope of a future not yet written. But within the walls of Sokolov's apartment, that promise was under siege. The relationship that had once seemed like mentorship had become a battleground of power, jealousy, and control. And in the first week of November 2019, the cracks widened into fractures. Neighbors would soon hear shouting late at night. Anastasia would confide to others that she was tired of his rage. And Sokolov himself would begin to unravel, consumed by the fear of losing the one person who still made him feel alive. For now, though, the world still saw them as teacher and student. The photographs still showed Anastasia smiling. The lectures still presented Sokolov as a man of knowledge. But beneath the surface, in the quiet tension of their private life, the stage was being set for a tragedy that would shock Russia, horrify the academic world, and leave a family shattered forever. Because even the brightest future can be extinguished in the shadows of obsession. The night she vanished. On the evening of November 7th, 2019, the walls of a modest apartment in St. Petersburg carried the sounds of a storm that no one could see. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, a heated argument that pierced the silence of the building. The voices belonged to two people, Anastasia Yeshchenko and her professor, Oleg Sokolov. It wasn't the first time neighbors had heard them argue, but this time the tone was different, sharper, more desperate, and filled with a finality that suggested something had broken between them. Those who listened from behind their doors would later remember Anastasia's voice rising in defiance, followed by sudden silence. That silence would prove to be the last sound she ever made. In the hours that followed, Anastasia's digital presence evaporated. Her phone went dark, messages from friends went unread, and her social media activity stopped entirely. For a young woman who was always connected, who called her parents frequently and kept close ties with friends, this absence was alarming. At first, those around her thought perhaps she needed space, that maybe she had left Sokolov's apartment after the fight. But as hours turned into days, worry transformed into dread. Her parents, who lived hundreds of miles away, grew frantic. Anastasia had been in touch with them almost daily, and the sudden silence was unlike her. They tried calling, texting, reaching out through friends, but there was nothing. For her family, who had always known her as lively, engaged, and responsible, the absence was terrifying. Meanwhile, Sokolov's behavior raised suspicions almost immediately. When questioned about Anastasia's whereabouts, his answers were inconsistent, fragmented. To one person, he said she had left after their argument. To another, he claimed she had been upset and needed time alone. His explanations shifted depending on who asked, and the inconsistencies quickly caught the attention of investigators. Police began their inquiries, starting with the last known location of Anastasia, Sokolov's apartment. Officers noted that he seemed nervous, evasive. The once confident professor, known for his eloquence in lectures, stumbled over his words when asked about her disappearance. He tried to assure them that she had walked out after the argument, but officers noticed there was no evidence that she had ever left. Anastasia's phone remained inactive. Her bank cards showed no activity. She had not been seen on surveillance cameras leaving the building. The threads of her life had been cut all at once, as if she had vanished into thin air. For investigators, the silence spoke volumes. Young people do not simply disappear without leaving traces. They call friends. They post on social media. They withdraw money. They leave footprints of their presence. Anastasia left nothing. The absence of activity was, in itself, a loud alarm. At the same time, whispers began to circulate about the true nature of her relationship with Sokolov. Friends revealed to police that Anastasia had expressed doubts about their future together. She had grown increasingly unhappy, confiding to some that she was considering leaving him. Those closest to her spoke of his temper, his jealousy, and her unease. The picture emerging was not of a woman who ran away willingly, but of one who may have been trapped in a dangerous situation. Investigators pressed harder. They asked neighbors what they had heard. Several confirmed the sound of an argument on the night Anastasia disappeared. Loud voices, anger spilling into the walls, followed by quiet. It was the kind of silence that left an imprint, the kind that neighbors remembered days later when police knocked on their doors. Sokolov insisted that Anastasia had left. He repeated the story with growing agitation, but investigators noticed the cracks. There were no witnesses who saw her walk out, no trace of her departure, only his word, and his word was growing thinner by the minute. For friends and family, the waiting was unbearable. They organized calls, reached out to authorities, begged for answers. They clung to hope that perhaps she was alive somewhere, hiding, taking time to herself. But in their hearts, they knew. Anastasia was not the kind of woman to disappear without explanation. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The pressure mounted, and within days, police began to shift their focus squarely onto Oleg Sokolov. His reputation as a historian could not shield him from suspicion. Behind the image of a celebrated professor was a man whose story no longer made sense. Each passing day, his mask of credibility cracked further, revealing not brilliance, but something sinister. What began as a missing person case, a young woman gone silent, was slowly transforming into something darker. Investigators sensed that they were not searching for a runaway. They were searching for a victim. And soon, evidence would surface in the most horrific way imaginable. Because sometimes rivers give up their secrets. The first clues in the dark. For several days after Anastasia's sudden disappearance, the city of St. Petersburg lived with a sense of unease. Her parents begged for answers. Her friends pressed police to dig deeper, and the investigators quietly began to tighten the circle around Oleg Sokolov. At first, it was still possible to imagine that Anastasia had left voluntarily. Perhaps she needed distance. Perhaps she had traveled somewhere unannounced. But for detectives, the absence of proof was itself a kind of evidence. In today's world, people leave digital shadows. Phones ping towers. Credit cards leave trails. Cameras capture movements. Anastasia's life left nothing. It was as if her existence had been switched off the moment she entered that apartment. Detectives revisited Sokolov's story. He repeated that Anastasia had stormed out after their fight, but he could not explain why her phone was silent. He could not explain why she had not returned to her family or contacted friends. And as the pressure grew, his composure began to falter. The professor, who once commanded lecture halls with eloquence, now stumbled, stammered, and contradicted himself in interviews. Then came the neighbors' testimonies. Several remembered hearing a woman's voice raised in anger on the night of November 7th. One neighbor told police that the shouting seemed intense, filled with desperation. After that, silence. Another said they had heard Sokolov pacing in the hallway, muttering to himself, long into the night. These fragments of memory, while not conclusive, painted a disturbing picture. Meanwhile, Anastasia's friends provided a painful context. They told police about the volatility of the relationship. They recalled how she had confided doubts, how she sometimes expressed fear about Sokolov's temper. One friend said she had spoken of leaving him, of reclaiming her independence. That revelation would later feel like an omen, because in controlling, possessive relationships, attempts to leave can become the most dangerous moments of all. Still, investigators needed more than suspicions. They needed something tangible, and soon, fate, or perhaps chance, would hand them the first real clue. On the morning of November 9th, a fisherman cast his line into the cold waters of the Moika River. The sun was weak, the sky grey, and the air bit with the chill of early winter. As he stood on the embankment, something unusual drifted near the surface. A black plastic bag, swollen and heavy, caught against the current. It might have been nothing more than refuse, but when the bag tore against jagged ice near the bank, Something pale slipped through the rip. The fisherman froze. It was not wood, not trash. It was unmistakably human, a severed arm, white against the dark water. His hands shook as he called authorities. Within hours, police divers were in the river. And as they combed the waters, more bags surfaced, each revealing a nightmare. Inside were pieces of a human body, crudely dismembered, wrapped as though the killer believed the river could swallow the evidence forever. The forensic team moved quickly. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Anastasia Yeshchenko. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. What had been whispered about as a missing person case was now revealed as something far more grotesque. The young student had not simply vanished. She had been murdered, cut apart, and discarded. And suspicion, which had already lingered around Oleg Sokolov, now hardened into certainty. When confronted with the evidence, Sokolov's mask of dignity shattered. His hands trembled. His speech faltered. Detectives noted the collapse of the image he had so carefully built. The brilliant historian, the decorated scholar, the man in Napoleonic costume posing for cameras. Beneath it all was something far more monstrous. A search of his apartment confirmed their worst fears. The home was crowded with books, military memorabilia, sabers, and uniforms. But beneath the veneer of scholarship lay traces of horror, bloodstains, hastily cleaned but not erased, kitchen tools and saws that bore the marks of dismemberment. It was a grotesque scene, a collision of academic prestige and unimaginable violence. The evidence was overwhelming. Neighbors had heard the fight. Friends described the troubled relationship. The river gave up its secrets, and the apartment itself testified to what had happened. But the most chilling aspect was not just the crime, it was the betrayal. Anastasia had trusted Sokolov. He was her professor, her mentor, someone she once admired. The man who was supposed to guide her future instead destroyed it. For Russia, the revelation was unbearable. A respected figure of knowledge and history had committed an act of barbarity that belonged to the darkest corners of the past. As the remains of Anastasia were collected from the river and the crime scene sealed, investigators knew the case was entering a new phase. No longer a search for a missing woman, but the pursuit of justice for a young life cut short. And as Sokolov sat in custody, trembling, the public began to ask a question that would haunt the trial to come. How could such brutality hide behind the face of brilliance? The shocking discovery. When the first plastic bag was pulled from the icy waters of the Moika River, the city of St. Petersburg changed forever. The discovery of a severed arm floating near the embankment was horrifying enough. But as divers brought more bags to the surface, each heavy, each carrying fragments of a young woman's body, the scale of the crime became unbearable. By the time investigators confirmed the remains belonged to 24-year-old Anastasia Yeshchenko, the case had already spiraled into national outrage. What began as a missing person inquiry had transformed into one of the most grotesque crimes in modern Russian memory. But the horror did not end at the riverbank. When police raided Oleg Sokolov's cramped apartment, the facade of the respected professor collapsed completely. The home was filled with relics of Napoleonic history, military uniforms, sabers, old muskets, portraits, and medals. It looked, at first glance, like the sanctuary of a devoted historian. But beneath that theatrical display, investigators found something else, a crime scene drenched in brutality. Blood had seeped into corners despite his efforts to clean. Tools, knives, saws, kitchen equipment were found with traces of flesh and bone. Forensic experts later testified that the implements had been used to dismember Anastasia's body. It was a revelation so chilling that even seasoned investigators were shaken. To find such violence inside the home of a man who once lectured about honor and history created a grotesque dissonance. The two worlds, scholarship and savagery, had collided in the worst possible way. News of the search spread quickly through Russia. Headlines called it a crime from another century. People struggled to reconcile the image of Sokolov, the celebrated historian, with the reality of a man who stuffed his lover's remains into plastic bags and tried to feed them to a river. Students who had once admired him now recalled moments of unease, his quick temper, his authoritarian behavior in lectures, his obsession with Napoleon's era. Some admitted they had seen flashes of something darker, but had dismissed them as eccentricities of genius. Now, those memories were recast in horror. Colleagues, too, were forced to reckon with their silence. Many knew of his volatile moods, but few had spoken out. The question that echoed across Russia was simple: how was this allowed to happen? Forensic evidence pieced together the final hours of Anastasia's life. The argument that neighbors heard had spiraled out of control. In a fit of rage, Sokolov killed her. What followed was not an act of panic, but one of chilling calculation. He methodically dismembered her body, packing the pieces into bags, and planned to dispose of them in the Moika River. Investigators believed he thought the river would carry the evidence away, erasing the crime. But rivers, as one detective put it, have a way of giving up their secrets. The psychological portrait that emerged was disturbing. Witnesses described Sokolov as controlling and unstable, a man whose obsession with power and authority extended far beyond his academic interests. He often dressed in Napoleonic costume, reliving battles, surrounding himself with the symbols of command. Some began to wonder whether his fascination with domination and control had bled into his personal life, fueling the possessive rage that ended in murder. The discovery of Anastasia's remains did more than expose a killer. It shattered illusions about the institutions meant to protect students. How could a professor with a reputation for volatility be left unchecked for so long? How could a young woman be drawn into a relationship so imbalanced, with no intervention from those around her? These questions ignited public debates that went far beyond the crime itself. For Anastasia's family, the discoveries were unbearable. They had held out hope, however fragile, that their daughter might be found alive. Instead, they were handed fragments of her body pulled from the river. No words could capture their grief. Her mother wept silently in court later, clutching photographs of a smiling girl whose dreams had been cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. And as details leaked to the press, the public's outrage deepened. It was not just the act of murder, it was the grotesque betrayal of trust. A professor, entrusted with guiding young minds, had used his position to exploit, control, and ultimately destroy one of his students. For many, it was a crime that felt medieval in its cruelty, and yet chillingly modern in its exposure of systemic failures. By the time Sokolov was formally charged, the case had become more than a criminal proceeding. It was a reckoning with the dangers of unchecked authority, with the silence of colleagues who ignored warning signs, and with the vulnerability of students who are taught to admire brilliance, sometimes at the cost of their own safety. The shocking discovery of Anastasia's remains in the Moika River was not just evidence of a crime. It was a mirror, forcing an entire society to confront the darkness that can hide behind respectability. It revealed how easily power can be abused, how quickly admiration can turn into control, and how fatal silence can become. For Russia, the river carried not only the fragments of a young woman's life, but the weight of uncomfortable questions. And for the world watching, it was a reminder of a truth as old as history itself, that evil can wear the face of brilliance, and that behind even the most respected doors, horror can take shape unseen. The trial and the legacy of a tragedy. When the news of Oleg Sokolov's arrest broke, Russia was stunned. It was not only the brutality of the crime that horrified the nation, it was the identity of the man responsible. A decorated historian, once admired in lecture halls and paraded in Napoleonic costume at historical reenactments, was now exposed as a murderer who dismembered the body of his own student and lover. As details of the case spread, the shock turned into outrage. Newspapers filled with photographs of Anastasia, smiling, vibrant, full of life, next to grim images of police carrying bags from the Moika River. Television talk shows debated not only the crime itself, but the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. How could a man with a known violent temper remain in a position of power over students? How many people had overlooked the warning signs, dismissing them as eccentricity or genius? By the time the trial opened in 2020, the The courtroom had become a stage for more than just justice. It was a reckoning. Journalists packed the room. Students filled the benches, and activists gathered outside with signs demanding accountability. For them, the trial was not only about the death of one woman. It was about a system that too often protected men like Sokolov until it was too late. Inside the courtroom, the contrast was striking. Gone was the flamboyant professor who once commanded attention in military garb. In his place sat a frail, trembling man. He buried his face in his hands, whispered answers, and avoided the eyes of the crowd. But for Anastasia's family, there was no pity. They listened to every detail of the prosecution's case, silent but unyielding. Their daughter had been taken from them in the most horrific way possible. No performance of frailty could undo that. The prosecution painted a grim picture. They described how the argument between Anastasia and Sokolov escalated, how his temper spiraled into violence, and how, instead of remorse, he chose concealment. He cut her body into pieces, stuffed them into bags, and planned to throw them into the river as if she were refused to be forgotten. Witnesses testified about his jealousy, his volatility, and the controlling grip he had over Anastasia's life. Friends recalled her doubts, her fear, and her quiet plans to leave him. Each testimony built a portrait not of a crime of passion, but of a pattern of abuse that ended in murder. The defense tried to humanize him, presenting Sokolov as a man in declining health, mentally unstable, incapable of enduring harsh punishment. They portrayed him as broken, overwhelmed by passion, a victim of his own frailty. But the public was unmoved. For them, this was not the story of an old man's weakness. It was the story of a predator who had hidden behind academic prestige for far too long. As the trial continued, something larger took shape outside the courtroom. Protesters held banners demanding reform in universities. They called for stronger protections for students, more accountability for professors, and an end to the culture of silence that excused abusive behavior in the name of brilliance. Editorials in newspapers echoed the same questions. How many tragedies could be prevented if institutions listened to warnings sooner? How many lives could be saved if power was not allowed to mask cruelty? For older generations watching on television, the trial carried a deeper resonance. They saw in Sokolov's case echoes of a familiar pattern. Brilliant men excused for their flaws, authority left unchecked, institutions reluctant to intervene until disaster struck. It was a reminder that history does not only live in books and lectures, it repeats itself in human behavior, in the arrogance of power, and in the silence of those who choose not to act. In December 2020, the court delivered its verdict. Oleg Sokolov was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 12.5 years in a strict regime penal colony. The sentence brought mixed reactions. Some believed it was justice. Others argued it was far too lenient, a mere fraction of what he deserved for the brutality of his crime. But beyond the numbers, the legacy of the case was heavier. For Anastasia's family, no sentence could bring back their daughter. Her mother held photographs of her in court, her smile frozen in time, a reminder of a life stolen. For her friends, every memory was tinged with grief, the lively conversations, the laughter, the dreams that would never be realized. And for Russian society, the case became a symbol. Anastasia's death forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about power, silence, and accountability. Universities faced scrutiny over their handling of complaints, their willingness to look away when reputation overshadowed responsibility. Activists invoked Anastasia's name in calls for stronger protections against domestic violence and stricter boundaries between professors and students. The tragedy also carried a quieter, more haunting legacy. Parents whispered her story to their daughters as a warning: be careful who you trust. Students hesitated when admiration for a professor blurred into something more personal, and ordinary citizens, reading the headlines, felt a chilling reminder that behind intelligence and charm, darkness can still hide. Anastasia's story did not end with the trial. It lingers in memory, in whispered conversations, in debates about reform. It is invoked as a cautionary tale, a reminder that silence is dangerous, that power must always be questioned, and that respect should never be given blindly. In the end, the name Oleg Sokolov will not be remembered for academic brilliance or Napoleonic reenactments. It will be remembered for betrayal, brutality, and the fall from admiration to infamy. Anastasia Yeshchenko, though silenced, has become a symbol of what happens when warning signs are ignored, when institutions fail, and when society mistakes authority for virtue. Her life was cut short in the cruelest way, but the questions her death forced into the open about power, silence, and the responsibility to protect the vulnerable remain urgent and alive. They are questions that demand answers, not only in Russia, but everywhere. Because the legacy of Anastasia Yeshchenko is not just about what happened to her, it is about what must change so it never happens again. If Anastasia's story haunts you as much as it haunts us, help us keep her memory alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every interaction helps ensure that these forgotten cases are never silenced, and that every victim's story continues to be heard.